Thank you. And my name is Bingkan, and I'm from the Department of Physics in the University of Florida. So if you ask me what I work on, I often just say evolution, which is true both now and in my previous academic life. So I was trained as a theoretical physicist working on cosmological evolution of the early universe. But then I switched to biophysics, and I work on biological evolution. Now, of course, the word evolution here means different things in these two fields. In physics, it simply means changes over time. But in biology, it has a special meaning related to species. So this is basically what I'm going to talk about today. The fact that certain words in science have special and different meanings. In particular, I was asked to talk about the roles of theory, laws, and models. So I thought I will start from a few familiar examples in physics. And these are the Kepler's laws of planetary motion, the Newton's law of universal gravitation, and Einstein's theory of general relativity. So these are all about our understanding of the gravity. And in fact, they showed us how our understanding of gravity has developed deeper and deeper. At first, as Jacob and Jack has mentioned, things started from observations. So Kepler was the one who was able to make great telescopes, and he was able to find the precise orbits of the planets. But there was no explanation as to why the planet orbits were ellipses and so on. So then came Newton, who came up with his law of universal gravitation, and that provided a mechanism to explain Kepler's observations. It was also around that time that people started doing experiments to test the theories. And so Newton's laws were verified by experiments. And finally came Einstein, who was able to see through it all and put everything together in an elegant mathematical framework, which has now been called the theory of general relativity. And this was a result of abstraction and synthesis. So from these examples, we can already see that there's a process from laws to theory. This was a process of going from empirical and phenomenological findings to more general and fundamental understanding. So in the following, I'm going to give you a few more examples, both from cosmology and biology, and I hope they're more interesting and maybe even new to you. So I will start from Hubble's law, which basically says that our universe is, the galaxies are moving away from us. So this was an observation made by Hubble in 1929. He basically plotted the velocities. He plotted the velocities of the galaxies versus their distance. Now you can see the data points are actually quite scattered. But nevertheless, he famously drew this straight line across these points, and he proposed that the velocity is proportional to the distance. So given this poor data, I would say that it can be called a hypothesis at best. However, the measurements improved over time. As you can see by now, there is a great agreement with experiments. All the data points lie on this straight line within the error bars. And for your reference, Hubble's original plots only constituted of this tiny red corner here. So with this precision, I guess we have no hesitation to call it a law. By the way, something being called a law in science does not mean that it cannot be changed. In fact, one of the aspects of Hubble's law, which is the so-called Hubble's constant, which represents the slope of this line here, it has changed dramatically over the years. In fact, since 100 years ago, the value of this constant has been reduced by an order of magnitude, which means that Hubble got it wrong by a factor of 10. But that was because he did not have the precise telescopes, and he did not have the technology to make more precise measurements. All right, so now that we have Hubble's law, what do we do about it? In order to understand Hubble's law, where it comes from, we will need a model. And this model will provide a mechanism to explain Hubble's observations. We can represent a model in this picture. We're going to plot the size of the universe as a function of time. For a very long time, people believed that the universe is static, which means that the size does not change over time. It's represented by this horizontal line here. And those people included Einstein, which thought that the static model is very elegant because it means the universe doesn't change and is eternal. But this picture was seriously challenged by Hubble's observations, because the most natural explanation for Hubble's law is that the universe is expanding, which is why the galaxies are moving away from us. So this argument was so compelling that people had to abandon the static model, which is why you see why Einstein is making this gesture here, and he called it his biggest mistake in his life. So this is an example where in science, a model can be falsified if it doesn't agree with experiments. So now that we have a better model, which is the expanding universe, you may ask, what do we do about it? Well, we are going to use it to make predictions. First, we can try to predict the future. And there are basically two possibilities. Either the universe is going to continue to expand, which is the so-called open universe, or it can turn back at some point and go back to zero. This is the so-called closed universe. So the question is really, are we going to move infinitely apart, or are we going to collapse in the end? Now, the benefit of having a physical model of the universe is that we can predict under what conditions does each scenario happen. And in this particular case, it depends on the density of the total density of the universe. So with the current observations, we are standing on the upper branch, which means that the universe is expanding and it will continue to expand. In fact, it is accelerating. Now, it is actually more interesting to predict the past, which we didn't know before. And to do that, we can simply extrapolate the curves backwards in time. And as you can see, we almost invariably will hit zero at some point. So this will be called a singularity because the size of the universe was infinitesimally small, which also means that there is an infinitely high energy density at the beginning of the universe. It's like a big expansion, a big explosion, which of course you know that is called the Big Bang. So Big Bang used to be a prediction of a model, but now it has taken on a life of its own. So are we going to call it the Big Bang model, or are we going to call it the Big Bang theory? That's the question. Well, for those of you who have been watching TV, you know the answer, and that's the Big Bang theory. So this is a quote from Wikipedia. This is actually the first few sentences on the page of the Big Bang theory. Now, if you find yourself on the wrong page, you have to click the disambiguities. Okay, so it says the Big Bang theory is a cosmological model of the observable universe. Well, wait a second. This sentence basically means a theory is a model. Well, what's going on? Let's keep that in mind and read on. It says it's a cosmological model of the observable universe from the earliest known periods through its subsequent large-scale evolution. Well, here's our cameo appearance of the word evolution, which we'll come back to later. So the model offers a comprehensive explanation for a broad range of observed phenomena, including the abundance of light elements, the cosmic microwave background, large-scale structure, and our Hubble's law. So the emphasis here is the comprehensive explanation for a broad range of observed phenomena. It is this broadness which makes it a theory. Now, in order to see what this theory encompasses, let's look at this picture. It represents the evolution of the early universe, where here evolution simply means how the universe changes over time. At the beginning, there is a Big Bang, which is represented by this bright spot here. And then there is a period of very rapid expansion, which is represented by this large slope here. And that generated the light elements, the cosmic microwave background, the large-scale structure, and finally our Hubble's law. So you see that this is a very nice picture. It is called a theory, so is that true? Well, you see, something being called a theory doesn't mean that it has to be right in science. And in fact, a scientific theory has to be supported by experimental evidence. If it is not, then it will be falsified. But we have seen that the Big Bang theory has been supported by quite a few experiments, which includes the nucleosynthesis, the cosmic microwave background, large-scale structure, and so on. But unfortunately, there's one piece which is causing trouble. And this is the part which is this rapid expansion here. This part is called inflation. And this unfortunate terminology already suggests that it sounds like not a good thing. Well, that's the case. Inflation was originally introduced because it was necessary to help make the right predictions for cosmic microwave background and so on. So it is an integral part of the Big Bang theory. If inflation is in trouble, then the whole Big Bang theory is in trouble. So the problems with the inflation model is quite subtle, and I won't go into the details here. But I just wanted to give you a rough idea of how serious the problem is. First of all, there has been already some observations which are at odds with the model. And second, as a mathematical model, it actually has subtle inconsistencies that people started to notice. Now, people, of course, try to patch it up by making various modifications to it. But that actually led to a loss of predictability. To understand that, inflation generically would lead to something called a multiverse. You can think of them as many parallel universes. But without going into your wild sci-fi imaginations, let me just say that the problem is that you won't be able to know which of the parallel universes we should be in, and therefore you can't predict what's going to happen to us. So this led to the last problem, which is that inflation is almost becoming unfalsifiable as a model. Because if you can fit everything into this model, then it doesn't mean anything. So this is a very serious challenge to the foundation of science. And in fact, it indeed has caused a lot of controversies in the past few years. If you're interested in this debate, you can read this article in Scientific American. And a shout out to my PhD advisor, who is the middle author here. So I cannot say that my opinion is completely unbiased here. Okay, so now it seems like the Big Bang theory is in trouble. So what do we do with it? Well, we have to look for an alternative. And in this case, actually, the alternative is not that hard to describe. So again, we have this picture of the evolution of the early universe. You see that in this picture, the gradient here has been reduced, which means that the universe was not expanding so fast, which means there was no inflation. But in order to make the same predictions on the cosmic microwave background and other things, we need to add something else to it. In fact, we are going to add a period before the Big Bang. This is a period where the universe was contracting. And then at some point, it stopped contraction and switched to expansion. So naturally, this picture is called the Big Bounce. And just from the terminology, it sounds like a better model, isn't it? Because in order for our universe to be born, you need some contraction before. Okay, so this is the Big Bounce. So are we going to call it the Big Bounce theory or the Big Bounce model or something? Well, by now people have learned to be more cautious, and they actually invented a new term for this. This is called a scenario. So the Big Bounce is a scenario, and of course the Big Bang was the other scenario. And we will still wait to see which one eventually wins out in the end. So let me pause here and just say that in physical sciences, we have laws, models, and theory. The laws are usually coming from observations, and they represent empirical relations between the key variables. Then there are models which provide mechanisms that can help explain the observations. And we can also use the models to make predictions, and we can test them by checking these predictions. Then finally, we have theory, which is a synthesis. It's a general framework which synthesizes many models and observations. So notice that here I put laws and models in plural forms, and that's because you can have many laws, like Kepler had 3 and Newton had 4. But I put a theory in singular because theories tend to be singular. The dream of a physicist is to find the theory of everything. And of course, for that, one is enough. All right, I will switch gears here and go into biology. But before doing that, let's try to be a bit philosophical here. After staying at home for months, you might have started wondering where we are and how we got here. Well, this is the question of origin. In cosmology, we have talked about the origin of the universe. So when I switched to biology, I thought I could work on the origin of life. And wouldn't it be nice? Because then I will find the answer to life, the universe, and everything. Well, it turns out that this problem had been solved by Douglas Adams. And for those of you who don't know the answer, you can simply Google it. Okay, that was a bummer. So I had to move on and find a different problem. Then I came to the origin of species. And of course, by that, I mean evolution. But let me first ask you, is evolution a theory or phenomenon? Well, I guess for everyone here, you have no problem believing in evolution. But calling it a theory might make it sound like just an opinion, whereas it's actually something that happened. So again, here is the quote from Wikipedia. It says, evolution is a change in heritable traits of biological organisms over successive generations due to natural selection and other mechanisms. Notice the word mechanisms here, which we will come back to in a minute. But in this description, you notice that there's no mention of theory or model. Rather, it makes it sound like just a phenomena which happens. If you're not convinced, here is an example of evolution in real time. This is an experiment of evolution of antibiotic resistance in bacteria. So if I play the movie, what the scientists did was to grow bacteria in this huge petri dish. And then they put the petri dish into different sections. The numbers here represent the concentration of antibiotics. So when it's 0, it means there's no antibiotics. And when it's 1, it means the critical concentration of antibiotics, which was just enough to kill the bacteria. And as you go towards the center, you see like 1,000, which means 1,000 times the amount of antibiotics, which was more than enough to kill all the bacteria. That is before they evolved. So if I play the movie, you can see that if we grow the bacteria from the edges, first, they obviously was able to take over the habitats which were easy to live in. And then you see they acquired a mutation which allowed them to move to parts where they could not live before. Then, through a series of mutations, eventually they were able to survive even in the highest concentration of antibiotics. Now, these scientists were also able to map out the lineages of these bacteria. And these lineage trees look just like the tree of species in evolution. As you can see, they show you how they come from common ancestors. So I hope this gives another impression that evolution is something that just happens. But we often think of evolution as a theory due to Darwin. If evolution is actually a phenomenon, then what's Darwin's theory about? Well, it turns out that Darwin's theory was not about evolution, the idea of evolution itself, but it's actually about a particular mechanism of evolution, which is evolution by natural selection. And it was not even the first theory about evolution, because 50 years before him, Lamarck made a theory of evolution by transmutation. So let's look at both of them. Lamarck's theory was not entirely scientific. It actually involved a so-called life force, which does two things. First of all, it tends to complexify organisms so that they transmutate from basic life forms to more complicated, to more complex, higher animals. The other thing it does is to let organisms adapt to their local environments through use and disuse, as well as the inheritance of acquired traits. For example, if you exercise more, then you're going to grow stronger muscles. But then he says that the strong muscles will be passed on to their children so that your children are also stronger. It is this last part which Lamarck was labeled with. And in fact, it has now been called the Lamarckism, which is more appropriately called the neo-Lamarckism. So in comparison, Darwin's theory has three parts. The first part is he observed that there's always variation of traits among the population. And the second part is that he proposed that only the fittest will survive. This he had learned from animal breeding. And the third part is the inheritance of characters. Now, it is not enough for the fittest to survive, but also you need their offsprings to be relatively fitter too. So Darwin is mostly known for the second part, which is the survival of the fittest. In fact, he didn't have a good idea of the other two parts. He didn't know where the variations of traits come from, and he also only has a vague idea of how the characters are inherited. In fact, the term here, inheritance of characteristics, is quite broad because it could include the inheritance of acquired traits from Lamarck. And indeed, later, Darwin came up with his version of inheritance, which he called pangenesis, which I will explain in just a minute. But I want to point out that this model, this pangenesis, is as Lamarckian as Lamarckism gets. So nowadays, people tend to compare Lamarck and Darwin as two opposite ends of the spectrum. If Darwin knew this, he would have jumped out and shouted, "Wait, I'm actually Lamarckian." But people chose to forget about this part of him, and label the rest of it the neo-Darwinism. To help you understand the misnomer here, I'm representing both the ideas of Lamarck and Darwin by these circles. And it is this intersection here which became labeled by Lamarckism. And it is this other part, excluding this intersection, which is now labeled as neo-Darwinism. Okay, so as promised, I will talk just a bit about the pangenesis. So Darwin meant it as a model of inheritance. And what is it about? So it's basically about the germlines, which are the sperm cells and eggs, which can form embryos. And those will develop into an animal, including all the body cells. The question is whether there can be an arrow going back from the body cells to the germlines. And this is what pangenesis is about. Darwin imagined that there were particles which he called gemmules. These are little particles that circulate in our bloodstream, and they can record the changes in the body cells, and then they're going to pass these information to our gonads, which can then be passed on to the next generation. Well, now we know that this is not true. In fact, a decisive experiment was done by Weizmann in 1889, which is 30 years after Darwin. And the experiment went like this. It was a little bit cruel. He took mice and cut their tails. Then he bred them, only to find that the offspring, the newborn mice, still had tails. Well, he did it 900 times until he had enough. And then he decided that it is not possible to have the inheritance of acquired traits. This experiment was so compelling that it became known as Weizmann barrier, which basically says that the arrow pointing backwards has to be blocked. Well, it might sound a bit silly today because we know that if someone loses a limb, it's not going to affect his children. But remember that this was way before people knew about genetic inheritance or at DNAs or things like this. But we know that when you cut the tail of a mice, it's not going to affect the DNA, which is why it's not going to lose its tail. I mean, its offspring, it's not going to lose their tails. So just as you may think that that's the end of the story, nature played a trick on us. In fact, in the past few decades, people discovered epigenetic inheritance. In fact, there are many mechanisms which exactly enables this arrow backwards. I'm not going to go into details here, but I just wanted to say that these molecules and mechanisms are basically the modern version of the gemmules. In fact, an important experiment which helped establish epigenetic inheritance was again in the tail of mice. In this experiment, in this picture, you see two mice which are genetically identical, but notice that one of them has a kinky tail. Now, this kinkiness in the tail is not inherited genetically, and in fact, it's epigenetic. I hope you can feel a sense of irony here, because it's as if the mice are hiding all the secrets from us, or maybe they're doing experiments on us to see when we eventually figure it out. So joke aside, I'd like to point out that there's a difference in this situation from the scenarios in physics. Because in this case, these two possibilities, the genetic and epigenetic inheritance, they're not mutually exclusive. And that is why they're called different modes of inheritance, because they can exist simultaneously. So this is why we need a model to tell us under what conditions does each mode of inheritance play a bigger role. So I will basically stop here, and let's see what we have learned. So in biological sciences, again, you see a process of going from observation to mechanisms and then to a synthesis. Notice that I avoided using the words models and theory in this case. And instead, I call them modes of inheritance and evolutionary thoughts, as historians call them. And that's because things in biology tend to be more descriptive rather than quantitative. And so I often get this question, do we need models in biology? And my answer is always a definite yes. My hope here is that by making quantitative models and making predictions, we can turn the phenomena into laws, the modes into models, and thoughts into theory. So that's all the time we have, but I would be very happy to expand on this point in the discussion if you're interested. So let me thank you all, and I look forward to your questions.